bells carried through the morning mist, long before the sun touched the highest towers. Welcome, my friend. Draw a little nearer and leave the noise of your own road behind for a while. Beyond those ancient walls, every whispered promise weighs as heavily as a drawn sword, and every raven may carry the fate of a kingdom upon its wings. Listen closely now, for some stories begin not with battle, but with a silence that no one truly understood until it was too late. The bells of King's Landing rang before dawn, their deep voices rolling across the black waters of Blackwater Bay and through the narrow streets where bakers were only beginning to light their ovens. A pale mist drifted over the city walls, softening the sharp outlines of towers and rooftops until the Red Keep seemed to rise from a sea of cloud. Gulls wheeled above the harbor, crying over ships that rocked against their moorings, while the smell of salt mixed with smoke from thousands of hearths. Merchants opened shutters with stiff hands, unaware that by sunset many would speak of this day in frightened whispers. Gold cloaks marched through the streets in greater numbers than usual, their polished spears catching the first weak light of morning. Few questioned the sight. The city had known too many wars for armed men to stir immediate alarm. Within the Red Keep, silence ruled where music had once echoed through the halls. Servants walked quickly with lowered eyes, careful not to linger outside council chambers or royal apartments. Every tapestry seemed to hide listening ears, and every shadow hinted at another secret carried from one lord to the next. Ravens had flown before sunrise toward every corner of the realm, yet none carried invitations or words of friendship. Their messages bore the king's seal alone, pressed into black wax with the three-headed dragon of House Targaryen. Those who glimpsed the letters noticed only the unusually brief commands before the scrolls disappeared into leather satchels. King Aegon Targaryen stood alone before the Iron Throne long before the court assembled. The throne towered above him like a mountain of twisted blades, each sword reminding him of promises made and promises broken. He rested one hand upon a cold armrest fashioned from the melted steel of conquered kingdoms, feeling every notch left by centuries of rulers who had gripped it before him. The stories claimed the throne wounded unworthy kings, yet his palm remained uncut as he tightened his fingers around the jagged metal. He stared across the empty throne room with steady violet eyes, hearing only the distant crackle of torches and the faint clatter of mailed guards changing watch. His jaw hardened as old memories returned, not of glorious victories, but of councils where powerful lords smiled politely while quietly deciding the fate of their king. The doors opened with a slow groan, admitting the members of the small council, one by one. The Grand Maester bowed deeply, despite the stiffness in his back, while the Master of Coin offered practiced courtesies that revealed nothing behind careful eyes. The Lord Commander of the King's Guard entered in gleaming white armor, his face unreadable beneath silver hair cropped close to his scalp. Last came the hand of the king, Lord Daemon Baratheon, broad-shouldered and weathered by years of command. He studied the king for a long moment before kneeling. "Your Grace," he said quietly, "the realm awaits your judgment." Aegon answered only with a slight nod, allowing the silence to stretch until even seasoned counselors shifted uneasily. "The great houses believe they keep the peace," Aegon finally said, his voice calm enough to force every man present to lean closer. In truth, they keep only their own power. Every tax is bargained over, every decree is questioned, every royal command must pass through hands that think themselves equal to the crown. No one interrupted him, though several exchanged guarded glances. Lord Damon folded his arms within his cloak before speaking carefully. The realm has always rested upon the loyalty of its lords, Your Grace. Break that balance, and swords will answer where words once sufficed. The king's gaze settled upon his hand without anger, which somehow made the warning more unsettling. Aegon descended the steps of the Iron Throne with measured grace, his boots echoing against the stone floor, until he stood among his counselors instead of above them. "Then let the swords answer," he said. "For too long, the Iron Throne has begged permission to rule. That ends today." Even the Kingsguard knight blinked at the words, though his expression quickly returned to disciplined stillness. The Grand Maester opened his mouth to object, but Aegon raised a hand before any counsel could be offered. "The orders have already been sent. Royal garrisons move even now toward castles throughout the Crownlands. Their commanders answer to me alone." Shock rippled through the chamber like a cold wind. Lord Damon stepped forward despite himself, disbelief plain upon his face. "Without consulting the council?" he asked. "Without informing the wardens or the great houses?" The king met his eyes without hesitation, especially without informing them. For several heartbeats neither man moved, and every servant along the walls suddenly found intense interest in the stone beneath their feet. Outside, another bell sounded across the city, though none within the chamber seemed to hear it. Far beyond the capital, the first riders reached Rosby beneath gray skies heavy with rain. They carried crimson banners marked with the three-headed dragon and presented sealed commands bearing the royal seal. The castle gates opened without resistance, for no lord expected soldiers wearing the king's colors to arrive as enemies. Before midday, the captain of the garrison surrendered control of the walls in the king's name, insisting the order must surely have some reasonable explanation. Similar scenes unfolded at Stokeworth and Duskendale, where royal officers quietly assumed command of armories, granaries, and gatehouses before rumors could spread. No blood stained the stones. Yet every peaceful surrender tightened the king's grip upon the Crownlands. By afternoon, the whispers began their journey through King's Landing. Stable boys overheard guards speaking in hurried voices. Merchants noticed unfamiliar officers inspecting warehouses, and dock workers counted warships, preparing to leave harbor despite calm seas. In the wine sinks of Flea Bottom, men argued over whether pirates had returned or another pretender had raised a banner in the Stormlands. Others claimed the king feared invasion from across the narrow sea. None guessed the truth, because the truth seemed too strange to believe. The danger did not ride toward the Iron Throne. It rode outward from it. As evening settled over the city, Lord Damon stood alone upon a balcony overlooking Blackwater Bay. The wind tugged at his cloak while the last light faded behind distant hills, leaving only scattered lanterns burning across the harbor. He had served 2 kings faithfully and survived enough campaigns to recognize the first movements of war. Yet wars usually began with rebellion against the crown. not rebellion led by the crown itself. He wondered how many of the realm's great lords had already received ravens bearing impossible commands. When he closed his eyes, he could almost hear castles all across Westeros preparing to bolt their gates. The king spent the final hours of daylight in the royal library instead of the feast hall. Dust lay thick upon shelves filled with histories of conquest, succession, and civil war, while candles painted long shadows across faded maps of the Seven Kingdoms. Aegon paused before a worn account of Aegon the Conqueror and rested his fingers lightly upon its cracked leather binding. "You forged one realm," he murmured to the empty room. "I will save it from those who have divided it without drawing new borders." His words vanished into silence, unanswered except for the soft rustle of parchment, stirred by the evening breeze, entering through a narrow window. Night finally wrapped itself around the Red Keep, but sleep found few within its walls. Messengers came and went through hidden posterns beneath the castle, carrying fresh orders to captains who departed before moonrise. Torches burned atop the city walls until dawn seemed impossibly far away, and patrols doubled along every street leading toward the gates. Somewhere below, a lone singer began an old ballad about the dance of the dragons before being sharply ordered to stop by passing guards. The song ended after only a few verses, but its warning lingered in the darkness. Westeros had seen kings bring ruin before, and before another sunrise it would begin to wonder whether history had returned wearing a crown. The first raven reached Storm's End just after sunrise, its wings slick with rain from the narrow sea. The bird landed upon the rookery perch, trembling from exhaustion, and the maester removed the sealed message with careful hands before hurrying through corridors of ancient stone. Lord Lionel Baratheon broke the black wax beneath the gaze of his household knights, expecting another routine decree from King's Landing. Instead, he found a royal command ordering him to surrender 3 coastal castles into the direct custody of the crown, dismiss a portion of his household guard, and send his eldest son to the capital as a guest of the king until further notice. He read the letter twice before folding it with deliberate care. No man in the hall spoke until he finally looked up and said, "This is no request. It is the opening move of something far greater." Far to the north, another raven descended through cold winds into the towers of Winterfell. Lord Cregan Stark stood beside the great hearth when the maester presented the message, and the crackling fire was the only sound as his gray eyes moved across the parchment. He did not curse or strike the table as younger men might have done. Instead, he quietly handed the letter to his castellan, allowing each sentence to sink into the room like falling snow. The king demanded fresh taxes to support a greatly expanded royal army and instructed every northern lord to send hostages from their families to King's Landing before the next moon turned. "The king has forgotten how wide the north is," Cregan said at last, or perhaps he remembers it too well. In the eyrie, high above the clouds, Lady Jane Eyre stood beside an open window, while mountain winds carried the cries of falcons through the sky. The royal raven arrived before noon, and she smiled faintly as the maester approached, believing another courtly dispute required arbitration. Her expression vanished before she reached the end of the first page. The crown demanded that all mountain passes be placed under direct royal command, with officers appointed by the king instead of the Vale. She folded the parchment slowly, and watched the clouds drift beneath her castle. "A king who distrusts every lord," she murmured, "will soon discover that every lord distrusts the king." Word spread faster than the ravens themselves. Riders carried copies of the royal decrees from castle to castle, while merchants repeated half-understood tales in market squares and roadside inns. Some insisted the king had uncovered a vast conspiracy among the great houses. Others whispered that madness had finally taken hold within the Red Keep, as it had before in darker years of Targaryen rule. Veterans who still remembered stories of the Dance of the Dragons exchanged uneasy looks whenever dragons and kings were mentioned together. The realm had learned that civil war rarely announced itself with the clash of swords. More often it began with sealed letters and impossible demands. Within King's Landing, the Red Keep no longer resembled a royal residence, but a fortress preparing for siege. Wagon after wagon entered the outer gates carrying grain, salted meat, lamp oil, and quarrels for crossbows. The royal smithies worked without pause, their hammers ringing through the night as armorers repaired breastplates and forged fresh spearheads. Stable yards overflowed with newly purchased horses, while unfamiliar captains inspected men recruited from every corner of the Crownlands. The gold cloaks noticed that many of these soldiers did not answer to the city watch or to any noble banner. They answered only to officers bearing the king's personal seal. Lord Daemon Baratheon walked among those ranks beneath an overcast sky, speaking quietly with captains whose faces betrayed equal measures of loyalty and confusion. The discipline impressed him. These men had not been gathered in haste over a few days. Someone had trained them for months, beyond the notice of the court itself. He stopped beside a young sergeant tightening the straps of a polished breastplate. "How long have you served?" Daemon asked. "Nearly a year, my lord," the soldier replied. His Grace said the realm would soon require men who served only the Iron Throne. Daemon offered no answer, but the weight in his chest grew heavier with every step. That evening, the Hand sought a private audience with the king in the solar overlooking the city. Aegon stood beside the window, watching rain sweep across Blackwater Bay until the harbor disappeared behind a curtain of gray. "You hid an army beneath the realm's own gaze," Daemon said without ceremony. "Even your council knew nothing." The king remained silent for a long moment before replying. "Councils leak. Gold buys tongues. Lords purchase loyalty more easily than crowns." Daemon stepped closer, lowering his voice. "And what have you purchased instead?" Aegon finally turned to face him. "Time." The answer settled between them like cold iron. Daemon searched the king's face for some trace of uncertainty, but found only a weary determination that frightened him more than rage would have done. "If the great houses refuse these commands," he asked, "what then?" Aegon did not hesitate. "Then they declare themselves above the throne. Once they make that choice, the realm will know who truly seeks peace." Daemon drew a slow breath through clenched teeth. He had spent decades ending wars, yet he now stood beside a king who seemed prepared to begin one with open eyes. Before midnight, another meeting unfolded beneath the Red Keep, far below the great halls where noble guests slept unaware. Torchlight flickered across damp stone walls as cloaked figures gathered around a rough wooden table covered with maps. The king entered without heralds, dismissing all ceremony with a brief nod. Present were trusted captains, several lesser lords whose fortunes depended entirely upon the crown, and the master, responsible for the secret mustering of royal forces. They discussed supply routes, river crossings, loyal garrisons, and the speed with which ravens might carry warnings to hostile castles. Every plan suggested months of careful preparation. Nothing about the rebellion had been born from sudden anger. Beyond the capital, resistance quietly began to take shape. At River Run, Lord Edmund Tully refused to deliver hostages until every great house had spoken together. In the Reach, Lord Tyrrell called his bannermen under the harmless pretense of settling harvest disputes, though every knight understood the true reason for the summons. Along the western coast, Lannister outriders doubled their patrols and counted every royal ship passing through nearby waters. None of the great lords declared open defiance. Each instead chose caution, hoping another would move first and reveal the king's true intentions. Only one man rode in the opposite direction. Sir Harold Waters, a household knight long trusted by the crown, departed King's Landing carrying no banners and wearing plain traveling clothes beneath a weathered cloak. His saddlebags held neither gold nor weapons of unusual worth, only sealed letters written in the king's own hand. He rode by hidden roads through the Kingswood, avoiding castles and villages alike, changing horses wherever loyal men awaited him. Those letters were not addressed to great lords. They were meant for forgotten captains, hedge knights, and minor houses whose fortunes had long been overshadowed by greater powers. Aegon intended to build loyalty from the roots of the realm upward. As dawn approached once more, the first replies from the Seven Kingdoms began returning to King's Landing. Some were respectful refusals, wrapped in careful language. Others questioned the legality of the king's commands without directly denying them. A handful offered obedience, though always with conditions attached. Aegon read every letter himself before placing each into one of two piles upon his desk. The larger pile he marked with a single word in a neat hand: resist. The smaller required no mark at all, for those names he already intended to remember. Outside his window, the city stirred to another ordinary morning, unaware that every raven arriving at the Red Keep carried Westeros one measured step closer to war. 3 days passed before the first open refusal reached the Iron Throne, and by then every lord in the Seven Kingdoms had heard some version of the king's demands. Ravens flew so often that the skies above great castles seemed alive with black wings from dawn until dusk. Inns along the King's Road filled with merchants who spoke in lowered voices, each certain he possessed the truest account of events, though no two stories matched. Some claimed the king meant to strip every lord of his lands. Others insisted he sought only to punish a handful of traitors hidden among the great houses. The uncertainty proved almost as dangerous as the truth, for fear invited men to imagine disasters greater than those already unfolding. In the Riverlands, Lord Edmund Tully assembled his principal bannermen beneath the vaulted ceiling of River Run's great hall. Rain hammered the leaded windows, while the Red Fork churned below the castle walls, swollen by autumn storms that darkened both river and sky. Lords Bracken and Blackwood, united only by necessity, stood several paces apart with familiar suspicion lingering in their eyes. Frays, malisters, pipers, and vances filled the benches until scarcely a place remained unoccupied. Edmund allowed the murmuring to continue until the hall settled into silence. Then he held the king's letter high enough for every man to see the royal seal before breaking it once more and reading the demands aloud. The reaction came exactly as he expected. Several younger knights reached immediately for boasts of war, while older lords frowned into thoughtful silence, weighing consequences instead of glory. Lord Blackwood declared that surrendering hostages invited future tyranny, and Lord Bracken, though agreeing for entirely different reasons, nodded with surprising firmness. Today he asks for sons, one aging bannerman muttered. Tomorrow he asks for castles. Edmund raised a hand before the hall dissolved into shouting. No banners will be raised today, he said, not until we understand what game the king truly plays. Far away in the Red Keep, Aegon anticipated nearly every reply before the ravens arrived. Maps covered the great oak table in his private chamber, each marked with colored stones showing castles, roads, granaries, and rivers. Tiny carved dragons marked the positions of royal garrisons already secured within the crown lands, while black pieces identified houses expected to resist first. The king studied the board without triumph or hesitation, moving a single carved dragon toward the King's Road leading north. Beside him stood Sir Harold Waters, newly returned from his secret journey. Most accepted your letters, the knight reported quietly. Not because they love the crown, but because they have little love for the great lords who rule above them. Aegon looked up only briefly before returning his attention to the map. That was always the hope, he replied. The realm believes power belongs only to ancient houses, yet countless lesser lords bleed in their wars and receive nothing but forgotten promises. Harold considered the words carefully. He had visited small keeps where families remembered old slights far more clearly than ancient oaths. Men who had bent the knee to powerful neighbors for generations suddenly found themselves receiving letters signed by the king himself. It was enough to make some wonder whether their fortunes might finally change. The hand of the king found little comfort in these developments. Daemon Baratheon had spent the better part of 2 days questioning messengers, reviewing supply ledgers, and speaking privately with officers responsible for the city's defenses. Everywhere he turned, he discovered preparations hidden beneath ordinary duties. Grain purchased months earlier, horses acquired through intermediaries, blacksmiths quietly contracted long before any royal decree had been announced. The realization settled upon him with growing certainty. Aegon had begun preparing for this conflict nearly a year before uttering a single threatening word. Late that afternoon, Daemon entered the White Sword Tower, where the Lord Commander of the King's Guard sharpened his blade beside an open window. The rhythmic scrape of whetstone against Valyrian steel echoed softly through the chamber. "Did you know?" Daemon asked without greeting. The White Knight paused only for a heartbeat before answering. "I knew the king feared something. I did not know he intended to become the storm himself." Daemon rested both hands upon the window ledge, looking toward the crowded city below. If he has misjudged the realm, thousands will die before winter. The Lord Commander sheathed his sword and regarded the hand with steady blue eyes that had witnessed enough campaigns to distrust certainty. Kings often mistake obedience for loyalty, he said. Lords often mistake privilege for duty. Between those errors, common folk bury their sons. Damon gave a humorless smile at the truth of it. Then tell me, he asked, where does honor lie? The old knight answered without delay. Where it always has. In keeping your oath, even when every choice breaks a different one. While uncertainty spread among the great houses, another force moved unseen through Westeros. Men dressed as traders, wandering septons and humble scribes, rode between villages carrying messages hidden inside walking staffs, beneath saddle linings, or sewn into the hems of cloaks. They did not bear the king's seal. Instead, they answered to a network established years earlier under the quiet direction of the crown, reporting harvests, troop movements, disputes between neighboring lords, and the temper of the small folk. Their reports now flowed steadily toward King's Landing, painting a picture far clearer than any lord realized. Aegon knew which castles lacked food, which captains drank too heavily, and which bannermen secretly resented those above them. One report, however, disturbed even the king. It came from the Crownlands and spoke of strangers moving through abandoned villages near the Kingswood. They wore no house colors, paid in newly minted silver stags, and vanished before dawn whenever questioned. Witnesses believed them to be sellswords, yet no captain admitted hiring such men. Others whispered they were agents of one of the great houses gathering strength before open war began. Aegon read the report twice before passing it silently to Sir Harold. "Find them," he ordered. "If another hand guides this conflict, I intend to know whose." As the week drew to its close, the first blood was spilled, though not upon a battlefield. A royal courier carrying sealed orders toward Maidenpool failed to arrive at his destination. His horse wandered onto the King's Road riderless, its flanks stained with dried blood and one saddlebag missing. Searchers discovered the courier's body beneath a stand of oak trees before sunset, stripped of weapons but not of coin. The arrow lodged beneath his shoulder blade bore no markings to identify its maker. Even so, the message it carried had vanished. When news reached the Red Keep, no one needed to say aloud what every man already understood. The realm had crossed an invisible line from suspicion into violence. Whoever loosed that arrow had done more than kill a messenger. They had announced that shadows would fight alongside armies in the struggle to come. Aegon stood at the window of his solar, long after darkness covered King's Landing, watching distant torchlight flicker upon the city walls. Somewhere beyond those lights, an unseen enemy had made the first move against him, and for the first time since issuing his commands, the king realized the game before him was no longer entirely his own. The dead courier was brought through the mud gate before dawn beneath a rain-soaked cloak, his horse following behind with its head hanging low. Word of the murder spread among the guards before the body reached the Red Keep, and every retelling added another imagined detail until some swore the man's throat had been cut by assassins, while others claimed a dozen archers had ambushed him from the trees. The truth was plain enough for those who examined the corpse. One arrow had ended his life swiftly, and whoever loosed it had known exactly where to aim. The missing satchel mattered more than the wound itself. Somewhere beyond the city walls, royal orders were now in unknown hands. King Aegon listened without interruption As the captain of the guard delivered his report, he asked neither who was responsible nor whether suspects had been found, for he already knew no honest answer could yet be given. Instead, he requested every detail surrounding the courier's journey, every village where he had stopped, every traveler seen upon the King's Road during the previous 2 days. The captain hesitated only once before admitting that no witnesses recalled anything unusual. Aegon dismissed the man with a quiet nod and remained alone in the chamber long after the footsteps faded away. He understood that skilled enemies left behind silence instead of evidence. Before midday, Sir Harold Waters rode out with 20 mounted men chosen for sharp eyes rather than noble birth. They followed the King's Road to the place where the courier had fallen, dismounting beneath towering oaks whose leaves whispered in the autumn wind. The forest floor revealed little after days of rain, yet Harold noticed something that the first searchers had overlooked. Several branches high above the road had been freshly scarred, their bark stripped away where climbing ropes had bitten deep. Whoever had waited there possessed patience, discipline, and enough confidence to strike without fear of pursuit. This had not been the work of desperate bandits. One of the younger riders discovered broken feathers scattered beneath a tangle of thorn bushes. Harold crouched beside them, turning one slowly between his fingers. The shaft had shattered upon impact, but the dark gray fletching remained intact, unlike the white goose feathers favored by most bowyers in the crownlands. "Keep searching," he ordered, his voice barely louder than the wind. These men planned their escape before they loosed the arrow. His companions spread deeper into the woods while crows watched from high branches, their harsh calls echoing through the trees as though mocking every careful step. By evening, they reached a forgotten charcoal burner's hut hidden beside a narrow stream. The fire pit outside had grown cold, yet footprints surrounded it in every direction. Harold entered cautiously with his sword half drawn and found only abandoned blankets, empty wineskins, and the remains of a hastily eaten meal. There was one object left behind that caught his attention immediately. A silver stag lay upon the rough wooden table, newly minted and untouched by years of trade. He remembered the report of mysterious strangers paying with fresh coin, and unease settled over him like winter frost. Someone possessed both wealth and careful planning, and that combination rarely belonged to common outlaws. While Harold hunted shadows in the Kingswood, King's Landing grew increasingly restless. Merchants complained that soldiers now searched wagons entering the city, and fishermen grumbled that royal ships questioned every vessel approaching Blackwater Bay. Bread remained plentiful, but rumors fed the people more eagerly than any loaf. Housewives whispered the great armies were already marching toward the capital. Apprentices claimed dragons would soon darken the sky once more, though none had flown over the city in generations. The taverns of Flea Bottom rang with frightened laughter that carried little joy beneath its noise. Lord Damon Baratheon spent those same days meeting privately with envoys who had arrived from the Crownlands. Lesser lords, hedge knights, and landed knights came seeking reassurance that the king had not abandoned reason entirely. Damon answered each with careful honesty, promising only that he still served the peace of the realm as faithfully as he served the crown. After the last visitor departed, the hand remained seated before a cold hearth, staring at the empty chair across from him. He had begun to notice something unsettling. Many of the smaller houses did not fear the king nearly as much as they feared the great lords who condemned him. That realization followed Damon into the next meeting of the small council. The Master of Coin urged immediate confiscation of rebellious estates to strengthen the royal treasury, while the Grand Maester pleaded for one final round of negotiations before swords were drawn. Voices rose steadily until the chamber filled with arguments spoken over one another. Aegon allowed them to continue until exhaustion dulled every protest. "You believe this began with my decrees," he finally said. "It began years ago when every lord decided the Iron Throne required their permission before it could rule." No one answered, though several lowered their eyes. A raven arrived before sunset, bearing the seal of Casterly Rock. The letter inside was courteous, almost warm in its wording, but every sentence concealed firm refusal beneath polished language. Lord Lannister expressed undying loyalty to the crown, while declining to surrender hostages, reduce his household guard, or permit royal officers to inspect western castles. Similar messages soon followed from Highgarden and the Eyrie, each respectful in tone, yet unmistakable in purpose. The great houses had not formed an alliance, but they had independently reached the same conclusion. None intended to obey. The first open challenge came not from one of those mighty castles, but from Rosby, where the king's own garrison had taken control without bloodshed only days before. Shortly after midnight, unknown men opened a forgotten postern gate from within the walls. Armed riders poured into the castle courtyard before the alarm bells finished ringing, cutting down sleepy sentries and reclaiming the keep for House Rosby before sunrise. When the surviving royal soldiers staggered toward King's Landing, they brought grim news. Their attackers had fought with remarkable discipline, withdrawing the instant victory was secured rather than chasing fleeing enemies. Once again, no banners had been seen. When Sir Harold returned to the capital with the silver stag and his troubling discoveries, the king examined the coin beneath the light of a single candle. Its edges were flawless, its stamping recent, and its mint mark belonged unmistakably to the royal mint itself. Aegon turned it over slowly in his fingers before setting it upon the table. "Someone is funding trained soldiers with the crown's own coin," he said quietly. Damon frowned across the chamber, realizing the meaning before anyone spoke it aloud. Either the royal treasury had been compromised, or someone close enough to the throne had secretly diverted its wealth. Silence settled over the room as heavily as the stone walls surrounding it. Every trusted servant, every clerk, every officer who handled royal accounts suddenly became a possible suspect. The enemy was no longer merely beyond the gates of King's Landing or hidden among distant castles. He had reached into the machinery of the crown itself, stealing not only its silver, but perhaps its secrets as well. For the first time since the rebellion began, Aegon felt the ground beneath his carefully laid plans begin to shift, and he understood that the war he intended to control was becoming something far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. The discovery of the silver stag transformed suspicion into quiet panic within the Red Keep. Before the sun had fully risen, every chamber responsible for the royal treasury had been sealed by order of the king, and armed guards stood outside doors that only yesterday had welcomed clerks and stewards without question. Chests of coin were counted twice, then counted again under the watch of trusted captains whose loyalty had never before been questioned. The scratching of quills and the clink of silver echoed through stone vaults deep beneath the castle, where nervous accountants struggled to explain figures that no longer balanced. Some swore the ledgers had been altered. Others insisted the losses were too small to notice individually, yet together they amounted to a fortune capable of hiring an army. Aegon descended into the treasury himself, carrying neither crown nor sword, only a single lantern whose light danced across iron-bound chests stacked in neat rows. Dust clung to the corners of the vault, undisturbed except where countless boots had passed over the years. But one narrow passage near the rear wall caught his attention. The floor there had been swept recently, erasing the footprints that covered every other part of the chamber. He crouched without speaking, running his fingers over the cold stone until he found a faint scrape beside the base of the wall. It was not the mark of forced entry. It was the wear left behind by something heavy moved many times with great care. The master of the treasury trembled as the king questioned him beneath the dim glow of hanging lamps. The old man had served the crown faithfully through 2 reigns and looked more bewildered than frightened, though fear slowly overtook confusion as the questioning continued. "Your Grace," he said, his voice unsteady, "every withdrawal carried the proper seal. Every chest opened only after written approval." Aegon held up one of the forged warrants recovered from the records. The wax bore the royal dragon so perfectly that only the slightest flaw in the edge revealed the deception. Someone inside the Red Keep possessed not only access to the treasury, but the means to imitate the king's authority almost flawlessly. By midday, the arrests began. Clerks were taken from their desks without warning, storekeepers were questioned under armed guard, and several lesser officials disappeared into the castle's lower cells before word of their detention reached their own families. No screams echoed through the halls, no brutal punishments were displayed before the court. The king preferred silence. Silence unsettled men more deeply than public executions, for it allowed every guilty conscience to imagine the worst. Servants now glanced over their shoulders before speaking even harmless words, uncertain which ears belonged to loyal friends and which belonged to hidden informers. Lord Daemon watched these measures with increasing unease. He did not object to rooting out traitors, yet he recognized how quickly suspicion could consume an entire court. That afternoon he sought the Grand Maester, finding the elderly scholar arranging dried herbs within the rookery, while ravens muttered restlessly around them. "His Grace tightens his grip each day," Daemon said quietly. "If he squeezes much harder, he may crush those still faithful to him." The Grand Maester sighed heavily before setting aside a bundle of lavender. "Kings often believe certainty lies one accusation beyond the last. Rarely do they discover certainty waiting there." Before another council could assemble, Sir Harold requested permission to question the prisoners personally. Unlike the city jailers, he believed fear revealed little unless guided with patience. His first interviews produced nothing beyond trembling denials and confused explanations. Yet one young scribe offered an unexpected detail. Several months earlier, he had noticed duplicate accounting scrolls appearing overnight, though every clerk insisted they had written only one copy. At the time, he assumed another office required additional records. Only now did he wonder whether someone had quietly replaced the originals with carefully altered versions. That revelation sent Harold into the maze of record rooms beneath the Tower of the Hand. Shelves groaned beneath decades of tax rolls, shipping manifests, military rosters, and royal decrees tied neatly with fading ribbons. Dust clouded the air each time another bundle was opened, and hours passed beneath flickering candles before he found what he sought. Hidden among ordinary accounts were subtle changes made over many months. Small shipments of grain became larger ones. Modest payments to craftsmen grew into expensive contracts. Individually, they attracted no notice. Together, they concealed enough missing coin to finance hundreds of seasoned soldiers. As evening approached, another raven arrived from the Crownlands bearing darker news. Rosby had not merely reclaimed its castle. The attackers had vanished before dawn, leaving the rightful lord once again in possession of his lands, but refusing every reward offered for their service. Witnesses described disciplined men wearing plain cloaks with neither badges nor banners. Their commander never removed his helmet, and no one heard him speak above a whisper. They behaved less like sellsword seeking profit than soldiers carrying out precise instructions. When their work ended, they disappeared into the countryside as though swallowed by the earth itself. Aegon spread the newest reports across his solar beside maps already crowded with colored markers. Every unexplained attack, every stolen shipment, every murdered messenger seemed to follow a pattern just beyond clear understanding. The unknown force never sought glory, territory, or public allegiance. Instead, it weakened trust wherever it struck. Royal garrisons questioned local allies. Lords suspected neighboring houses. Couriers vanished, supplies disappeared, and certainty dissolved into rumor. "They do not wish to win battles," Aegon said at last, speaking more to himself than to those nearby. "They wish to make every man doubt the one beside him." Daemon studied the map before answering. If that is true, then they have already won their first victories. The king remained silent because he knew the hand spoke honestly. The great houses distrusted the crown. The crown distrusted its own servants. Lesser lords wondered which side would preserve their lands, while common folk no longer knew whose soldiers marched through their villages. An invisible enemy had turned suspicion into a weapon sharper than any sword forged in Westeros. That same night, beneath steady rain, a lone rider approached the walls of King's Landing, carrying no torch despite the darkness. The gate guards challenged him long before he reached the Barbican, yet he neither fled nor reached for a weapon. Instead, he raised both empty hands and announced that he bore a message intended for the king alone. Hidden beneath his cloak lay no blade, only a sealed wooden box bound with iron clasps. After a tense search, he was escorted into the Red Keep, where the box was placed upon a heavy table before Aegon, Daemon, Sir Harold, and the Lord Commander of the King's Guard. No one spoke as Harold carefully lifted the lid. Inside rested a single silver stag, identical to the one found in the Kingswood, a blood-stained arrow fletched with dark gray feathers, and a folded piece of parchment bearing neither seal nor signature. Aegon unfolded it slowly, while the others watched his face. The message contained only one sentence written in a steady, practiced hand. The king has mistaken the first move for the game itself. The room fell utterly silent, for at last their unseen enemy had spoken, and every man present understood that whoever had sent the box possessed knowledge of the king's plans far too intimate to have come from rumor alone. The letter remained upon the table long after every man in the chamber had finished reading it. No seal marked its origin, no flourish betrayed the hand that had penned it, and no hidden cipher revealed itself beneath candlelight. Aegon traced the edge of the parchment with one finger before folding it carefully and placing it beside the silver stag. Whoever had written those words possessed confidence, rare even among great lords. They had not threatened the king. They had challenged his understanding. That distinction troubled him more deeply than any open declaration of war. The writer who had delivered the box was questioned through the remainder of the night. He proved to be a common fisherman from a village east of Duskendale, weary from hard travel and visibly frightened by the grandeur of the Red Keep. He claimed a hooded stranger had approached him 3 days earlier, offering enough silver to feed his family through an entire winter if he carried the box untouched to King's Landing. The stranger had spoken with neither noble accent nor foreign tongue, keeping his face hidden beneath a plain traveling cloak. He said only one thing before he left, the fisherman recalled, wringing his rough hands together. "Tell the king the game has already begun." Harold searched the man's expression for deception, but found only honest fear. Satisfied that the messenger knew nothing more, Aegon ordered him released with the promised silver doubled. Damon raised an eyebrow after the fisherman had departed. "A generous reward for carrying the words of your enemy," he observed. The king looked toward the closed door without changing expression. He carried a warning, not a weapon. Men should not fear delivering messages more than drawing swords. Damon offered no reply, though he wondered whether the unknown author had counted upon exactly such mercy. At first light, Sir Harold returned to the Kingswood with a larger company than before. This time they searched not merely for tracks, but for places where disciplined men might hide without drawing notice. Hunters, charcoal burners, shepherds, and wandering septons were questioned one by one. Most had seen nothing unusual beyond frightened travelers hurrying along the roads, yet an elderly woodcutter eventually recalled a curious encounter. Several nights earlier, he had watched nearly 40 mounted men cross an abandoned Roman road deep within the forest, each rider leading a second horse burdened with covered packs. They carried no banners and kept absolute silence even while passing within bowshot of his campfire. Harold followed the old man's directions until the forgotten road emerged beneath tangled branches and moss-covered stone. Time had nearly claimed the ancient paving, but careful eyes could still distinguish the straight path winding through the trees. Broken twigs and fresh hoof prints confirmed that many horses had passed that way recently despite the rain. The column had traveled south rather than north, avoiding villages and main roads with deliberate care. One of Harold's scouts knelt beside a shallow stream and lifted something from the mud. It was an iron horseshoe stamped with a tiny mark shaped like a falcon's wing, a smith's emblem unfamiliar to every man present. Back in King's Landing, The small council struggled to contain a crisis that grew broader each day. Reports now arrived of lesser houses refusing to obey their traditional overlords while claiming direct loyalty to the crown. In the Reach, 2 neighboring lords had nearly come to blows over conflicting interpretations of the king's decrees before cooler heads separated them. Along the Blackwater Rush, several ferries refused passage to armed retainers carrying the banners of powerful houses unless they also displayed written authority from the Iron Throne. Old customs that had governed Westeros for generations were beginning to unravel under the weight of uncertainty. Every village seemed to invent its own understanding of royal law. The Grand Maester spread fresh reports across the council table, his tired eyes lingering on each, as though hoping the ink itself might offer wisdom. "This is no ordinary rebellion," he said quietly. "The realm fractures, not because armies have marched, but because trust has." Aegon stood at the great window overlooking the city, watching smoke rise from countless chimneys beneath a gray autumn sky. "Trust, built upon fear, deserves to fracture," he answered. Daemon turned sharply toward him. "Perhaps," he replied, "but fear often leaves nothing stronger in its place." That afternoon, another unexpected visitor requested audience with the king. Lady Ellen Hayford, whose modest lands lay scarcely a day's ride from the capital, entered the throne room accompanied by only 2 sworn swords. She knelt properly before the Iron Throne, yet carried herself with quiet confidence, despite the tension surrounding the court. "Your Grace," she began, "my house remains loyal to the crown, but riders have crossed my lands bearing no colors and asking strange questions. They seek forgotten roads, abandoned keeps, and wells that no traveler should know." Aegon descended from the throne himself, asking her to describe every detail she remembered. As Lady Ellen spoke, Harold's report from the Kingswood returned vividly to the king's mind. Forgotten roads, hidden routes, men avoiding every castle and market town. A pattern slowly emerged where before he had seen only scattered incidents. Someone was moving troops across Westeros without relying upon the King's Road or the major castles controlled by the great houses. Such knowledge could not be gathered quickly. It required years spent studying the neglected corners of the realm where maps ended and memory began. "Have those riders returned?" Aegon asked. Lady Ellen shook her head. "No, Your Grace. They vanished before dawn, as though the woods themselves had swallowed them." That evening the king summoned every surviving map from the royal archives, including brittle parchments dating back to the days before Aegon's conquest. Servants covered long tables with faded charts showing Roman roads, forgotten fortifications, dried riverbeds, abandoned mines, and hunting trails no longer marked on modern maps. Hours passed as candles burned lower and lower, while Aegon, Daemon, Harold, and the Grand Maester compared ancient routes with recent reports. Gradually, the scattered sightings connected into a web stretching from the Crownlands toward the Riverlands and the Reach. Whoever directed the hidden soldiers understood the oldest veins of Westeros better than many lords knew their own domains. Near midnight, Harold rested one finger upon a weathered map of the Kingswood. "If these roads continue as the old survey claims," he said, "they meet at only one place before crossing into the Riverlands." The room grew still as every eye followed his hand to a faded symbol almost erased by time. There, surrounded by forests and long-abandoned villages, stood the ruins of Summerhall, once a proud Targaryen palace reduced to ash decades earlier. The name stirred uncomfortable memories in every man present. It was a place associated with tragedy, fire, and unanswered questions, and few travelers willingly ventured near its blackened walls. Aegon stared at the ruined palace for a long time before rolling the map closed with deliberate care. "Prepare 50 riders," he ordered at last. "No banners, no trumpets. We leave before dawn." Daemon frowned immediately. "Your Grace, if this is a trap, the realm cannot afford to lose its king." Aegon fastened his sword belt with calm determination. "If it is a trap, then our enemy expects me to remain safely behind these walls. I intend to disappoint him." Outside the Red Keep, the bells marked the passing of another hour while the city slept in uneasy ignorance, unaware that before sunrise, its king would ride toward the ashes of Summerhall, where the first true answers of the rebellion might finally be waiting. Before the eastern sky showed the faintest trace of light, the postern gate of the Red Keep opened without ceremony. 50 mounted riders emerged in silence, their cloaks plain, their shields left behind, and their armor hidden beneath dark wool to avoid drawing attention upon the King's Road. King Aegon rode at their head with Sir Harold Waters close beside him, while Lord Daemon reluctantly followed after, exhausting every argument that might have persuaded the king to remain in the capital. A cold wind drifted in from Blackwater Bay, carrying the smell of damp earth and salt across the sleeping fields beyond the city. Behind them, King's Landing faded into darkness, its towers swallowed by mist, as though the realm itself wished to conceal where its king had gone. The company avoided villages whenever possible, leaving the King's Road to follow narrow hunting trails, marked only on the oldest maps recovered from the royal archives. Fallen branches scraped against cloaks and saddles, while horses picked their way through thick woods that had not known the tread of armies for generations. More than once Harold dismounted to examine faint signs left behind by earlier travelers. Hoofprints appeared where rain should have erased them, suggesting dozens of horses had crossed recently, despite the weather. Whoever they pursued understood how to move quickly without leaving obvious traces. Yet even the most careful men could not command the forest itself. By the second evening, they reached the outskirts of Summerhall. Once the proud retreat of House Targaryen, the palace now stood as a broken shell, surrounded by blackened stone and ancient trees that had slowly reclaimed abandoned courtyards. Crumbling towers leaned at uneasy angles, their shattered windows staring across the countryside like empty eyes. Ivy crept over cracked walls where banners had once flown, and the silence carried an unsettling weight. Even birds avoided the ruined halls, leaving only the whisper of wind moving through scorched arches that still bore the scars of the Great Fire. Every man in the company had heard tales of the tragedy that consumed the palace decades before, yet standing before its ruins proved far more unsettling than any story. Aegon ordered the horses concealed among thick oaks before the riders continued on foot. They moved cautiously through collapsed gateways and over broken flagstones half buried beneath weeds, their hands never straying far from sword hilts. The king paused beside a charred column where melted stone still marked the terrible heat that had once swept through these halls. He remembered the old histories describing princes, dreams, and dragon fire ending in catastrophe, and for a brief moment the weight of his own decision seemed strangely close to those forgotten failures. Then Harold raised one hand, signaling for absolute silence. Fresh footprints crossed the dust, covering what had once been the palace courtyard. They were not the scattered tracks of curious travelers, but the repeated passage of many disciplined men entering and leaving the same ruined doorway. Kneeling beside them, Harold noticed that several prints belonged to boots made for soldiers rather than peasants or hunters. One heel carried the distinctive pattern left by a cobbler in King's Landing, while another bore the same falcon wing mark found upon the abandoned horseshoe in the Kingswood. "They have been here within 2 days," Harold whispered. "Perhaps less." The riders spread through the ruins in carefully assigned pairs, searching every chamber that remained standing. Most discovered nothing beyond collapsed ceilings, rotten beams, and the lingering smell of damp ash. Then one of the scouts called softly from below ground. Hidden beneath a fallen staircase lay the entrance to an old wine cellar, its heavy oak door recently repaired despite the surrounding decay. Egan descended first, torch held high, revealing a narrow passage that stretched deeper beneath the palace than any map had shown. The walls bore fresh scrape marks where crates had been dragged across the stone floor. Someone had transformed forgotten ruins into a secret storehouse. Inside the cellar stood rows of barrels, sacks of grain, bundles of arrows, and racks of carefully maintained weapons wrapped against moisture. The supplies were enough to feed several hundred soldiers for weeks without outside assistance. Harold split open one barrel expecting wine, but found polished spearheads packed carefully inside instead. Another contained crossbow strings coated in wax, while a third concealed bags of newly minted silver stags identical to those already discovered. Damon examined the stores with growing disbelief. "This was prepared long before the king issued his decrees," he said quietly. "Months, perhaps years." Near the rear of the cellar, Aegon noticed a heavy table supporting maps weighed down with smooth river stones. Candles had burned there recently, leaving pools of hardened wax still untouched by dust. The maps displayed not only the crown lands, but nearly every region of Westeros, marked with symbols indicating hidden routes, supply caches, isolated bridges, and forgotten crossings. Whoever planned this network possessed extraordinary knowledge of the realm's neglected places. Yet one detail drew the king's attention above all others. Several royal garrisons recently established by his own orders had already been marked upon the maps before his soldiers had even arrived. No one spoke for several long moments. Damon slowly looked toward the king, understanding the implication before either man gave it voice. "Someone knew your plans while they were still being written," he said. Aegon's expression remained calm, though his thoughts raced. Only a handful of men had known the locations of those garrisons before the orders were sealed. Either one of his closest advisors had betrayed him, or another hidden source existed within the heart of the Red Keep itself. The unseen enemy had not merely anticipated the king's rebellion, they had prepared for it from the very beginning. A sudden whistle echoed faintly through the ruined palace above. Harold's head snapped upward as every instinct sharpened at once. Another whistle answered from farther away, followed almost immediately by the unmistakable sound of boots striking broken stone. "We're discovered," he said, drawing his sword in one smooth motion. Torches were extinguished at once, plunging the cellar into darkness, broken only by narrow shafts of daylight filtering through cracks overhead. The king ordered half the company toward the entrance while the remainder secured the supplies, but events were already moving faster than commands could follow. Crossbow bolts slammed into the doorway as the first attackers descended the stair. Steel rang against steel in the confined passage where numbers meant little and courage everything. The royal guards formed a tight shield wall despite the darkness, forcing their enemies to fight one man at a time. Aegon himself joined the line without hesitation, his blade turning aside a spear thrust before striking its owner from the narrow steps. The attackers wore plain armor without heraldry, their faces hidden beneath simple iron helmets, and not one shouted a battle cry. They fought with cold precision, retreating the instant resistance stiffened, then advancing again from another direction, through passages hidden within the old foundations. The skirmish lasted only minutes, yet it revealed enough to chill every survivor. When Harold finally forced his way onto the surface with a handful of riders, the enemy had already withdrawn into the surrounding woods, leaving behind only 3 dead and 2 wounded. One wounded man tried to seize a dagger and end his own life before capture, but Harold knocked the weapon aside and bound him tightly. The prisoner's armor carried no badge, his clothing no identifying stitch, and even his sword bore the marks of careful filing where a smith's signature should have remained. Someone had erased every trace of the man's origin before sending him into battle. As dusk settled over the blackened ruins of Summerhall, Aegon stood beside the captured soldier, while smoke from dying torches drifted into the evening sky. The hidden supply depot had been uncovered, yet the force behind it remained nameless, disciplined, and always one step ahead. Worse still, the maps proved beyond doubt that the enemy possessed knowledge drawn from the king's own councils. Summerhall had yielded answers, but each answer opened another mystery more dangerous than the last. Before dawn, the prisoner would be questioned, and Aegon intended to learn whether the first crack in the conspiracy finally lay within his grasp, or whether he had merely uncovered another layer of a far deeper design. The prisoner survived the night despite 2 attempts to end his own life. The first came when he threw himself against a broken stone pillar, hard enough to split the skin above his brow, and the second when he tried to bite through a small glass capsule hidden beneath a false tooth. Sir Harold reacted quickly enough to wrench the man's jaw open before the poison shattered between his teeth, though several cuts bled across the prisoner's gums where the glass had already cracked. The captive did not curse or plead after being restrained again. He simply stared ahead with calm gray eyes, as if accepting that one fate had been exchanged for another. Morning light filtered through the ruined arches of Summerhall, while the king sat across from the prisoner in what had once been the palace's great hall. Broken columns cast long shadows over the cracked floor, and the cold air carried the smell of wet stone after a night of steady rain. Aegon dismissed all but Daemon and Harold before speaking. "You have been trained well," he said evenly. Most men fear death. You fear speaking." The prisoner remained silent for so long that Damon wondered whether the effort had already failed, but eventually the man lifted his eyes and answered in a hoarse voice, "Some truths kill more surely than poison." Harold knelt beside him, studying the prisoner's hands instead of his face. Thick calluses lined the fingers exactly where years of sword practice would leave them, yet faint ink stains lingered beneath several fingernails. "You learned your letters?" Harold observed quietly. "Not common among hired blades." The man gave no visible reaction, though one finger twitched almost imperceptibly. Harold noticed. "Someone educated you before teaching you to fight." Again the silence stretched between them, but this time it felt less certain than before. Aegon leaned forward slightly. "Who commands you?" he asked. "Which lord pays for this war?" The prisoner looked directly at the king, and for the first time a trace of pity entered his expression. "You still believe a lord stands behind it," he replied. "That is why you are losing." Damon stepped closer, unable to restrain himself. "Then who?" The captive's lips parted, but before another word escaped, a sharp hiss cut through the air. The arrow struck with terrifying precision. It burst through the narrow window behind the prisoner and buried itself deep in his throat before anyone had time to react. Blood splashed across the ancient stone floor as the man collapsed sideways, his eyes wide with surprise rather than pain. Harold was already moving, racing toward the shattered window while guards rushed into the ruined hall with drawn swords. Outside, only the whispering trees answered them. Somewhere beyond the broken walls, an unseen archer had loosed a single perfect shot and vanished before the echo faded. The riders scattered through the surrounding woods, searching every path leading away from Summer Hall. Fresh hoof prints appeared for a short distance before disappearing into rocky ground where no trail remained to follow. One scout discovered a discarded bowstring still warm from use, while another found the body of a lookout whose throat had been cut moments earlier. Whoever had silenced the prisoner had also eliminated one of their own sentries, leaving nothing behind that might identify the company. Harold stood over the dead lookout and slowly shook his head. "They abandon no weakness," he murmured, "not even their own." Back within the ruins, Damon examined the fatal arrow after the fletching had been carefully removed from the corpse. Like the others, it bore dark gray feathers and no maker's mark upon the shaft. Yet near the iron head, hidden beneath a thin wrapping of waxed thread, the royal smith noticed something no one else had seen. A tiny groove circled the wood, not decorative but deliberate, placed exactly where an experienced fletcher might measure balance. "This is not the work of village craftsmen," Damon said. "These arrows were made in quantity by masters who expected uniformity." Aegon understood the implication immediately. An organization capable of such discipline required workshops, supplies, and years of preparation. The king ordered every cache within Summer Hall searched before the company departed. Hidden beneath loose stones, they uncovered sealed ledgers, protected inside waxed leather cases, along with coded correspondence too complex to decipher on the spot. More revealing than either were the supply records. Grain had arrived from the Reach under false names. Iron came through merchants operating near Gulltown. Leather originated in the Riverlands, while lamp oil had been purchased in King's Landing itself. None of the shipments were large enough to attract notice, yet together they sustained a hidden army stretching across the realm. Every kingdom had unknowingly contributed to its strength. Harold rode beside the king as they left the ruins behind. Neither man spoke for several miles, each occupied by the same troubling thought. Finally, Harold broke the silence. "This conspiracy crosses every border," he said. "If one great house stood behind it, another would surely have uncovered the scheme." Egon nodded without taking his eyes from the road ahead. "Which means our enemy profits from keeping every house suspicious of the others." Damon, riding just behind them, heard the exchange and felt an unwelcome realization settle over him. The conspiracy did not seek to replace the king with another claimant. It sought to ensure that no ruler could ever fully trust the realm again. As the company neared the King's Road, a column of exhausted riders approached from the direction of King's Landing. Their captain dismounted before the king, mud covering both horse and armor, after riding day and night without pause. He knelt, struggling to steady his breathing before speaking. "Your Grace, the city remains secure, but grave news has arrived from the Riverlands." Aegon's expression hardened. "Speak." The captain swallowed once. Lord Edmund Tully's convoy was attacked while returning from a gathering of his bannermen. His heir has been taken alive. The attackers carried no banners, and survivors accuse both the Crown and House Lannister of arranging the ambush. Daemon closed his eyes for a brief moment. It was exactly the kind of blow their hidden enemy preferred. Before any investigation could begin, suspicion would race ahead of truth. The Riverlands would blame the West. The West would suspect the Iron Throne. Every denial would sound like another lie to ears already poisoned by fear. A single kidnapping threatened to accomplish what 1,000 soldiers could not. The king urged his horse into a faster pace without another word. Behind him, the riders followed through gathering clouds as distant thunder rolled across the countryside. Somewhere in the Riverlands, a noble heir had vanished, and by the time the truth emerged, armies might already be marching beneath banners raised against the wrong enemies. Aegon had begun this struggle believing he could bend the great houses back beneath the authority of the Iron Throne. Now he faced an adversary who twisted every decision into fresh division, and the realm itself had become the battlefield on which the next move would be made. The ride back to King's Landing left little time for rest. Rain swept across the King's Road in relentless waves, turning packed earth into deep mud that clung to hooves and slowed even the strongest horses. Villages that had once greeted royal riders with cheers now watched from shuttered windows, their people unwilling to reveal where their loyalties truly lay. Aegon noticed every guarded glance, every door quietly barred as his company passed. The rebellion had not yet become open war, yet fear had already conquered more ground than any army. When the king returned to the Red Keep, the castle no longer felt like the seat of a confident ruler. Guards challenged familiar faces twice before allowing them through the gates, and servants spoke in whispers whenever armored men entered a corridor. The small council assembled within the hour, though several seats remained empty while their occupants dealt with unrest elsewhere in the city. Scrolls covered the council table in untidy stacks, each bearing reports of fresh disputes between neighboring lords, interrupted trade caravans, and frightened villages refusing entry to armed strangers. Damon studied the growing mountain of parchment with grim resignation. The realm tears itself apart faster than we can answer a single question, he said. The captain who had carried news from the Riverlands stepped forward once more, placing a blood-stained cloak upon the table. It belonged to Sir Brynden Tully, eldest son and heir of River Run, taken alive while escorting envoys home after his father's council. According to the survivors, nearly 60 mounted men had struck at dusk from both sides of a wooded valley, killing only those who resisted while ignoring wagons filled with silver and provisions. They had neither demanded ransom nor declared allegiance to any lord. Before disappearing, their commander left behind 2 banners deliberately planted beside the road. One bore the crimson lion of House Lannister, the other carried the black, 3-headed dragon of the king. Silence settled over the chamber as every man understood the cruelty of that choice. The false banners guaranteed that no witness would agree on what had truly happened. Some would swear the Crown and the Westerlands had joined together against River Run. Others would insist one side sought only to frame the other. Aegon looked toward Daemon, whose weathered face revealed no surprise, only growing concern. They no longer hide what they are doing, the Hand observed quietly. They want the realm to argue over the lie instead of searching for the truth. Before the council could continue, another raven arrived from the west. Its message bore the seal of Casterly Rock and had been written in Lord Lannister's own hand with unusual haste. The Lord of the Rock denied any involvement in the kidnapping and accused unknown agents of murdering 2 of his own household knights along the Gold Road while wearing cloaks bearing Lannister colors. Similar reports, he warned, had begun reaching him from several bannermen. Aegon read the letter twice before passing it to Daemon. Whoever orchestrated these attacks had begun striking every great house with equal care, ensuring that suspicion spread in every direction at once. That afternoon, Sir Harold summoned the king to the chambers, where the coded ledgers recovered from Summerhall were finally yielding their secrets. 3 Meesters and 4 experienced scribes had spent 2 sleepless nights comparing repeated symbols, altered numbers, and hidden references buried inside seemingly ordinary trade accounts. Sheets of parchment covered every available surface, connected by strings and marked with charcoal notes. Harold pointed toward one column of figures that appeared meaningless until viewed beside shipping records from King's Landing. "These are not payments," he explained. "They are dates." Aegon followed the sequence slowly until the pattern became unmistakable. Every coded entry matched an attack that had already taken place somewhere within the realm: the murdered courier, the seizure of Rosby, the ambush near River Run. Even the assault beneath Summerhall had been prepared weeks before the king discovered the hidden depot. More disturbing still were several entries whose dates had not yet arrived. The conspiracy had planned future operations with the same cold precision as those already completed. Somewhere in Westeros, men were already riding toward targets that the Crown did not yet know existed. Harold spread another decoded page across the table. Unlike the others, it contained no dates, but a list of names followed by simple marks. Most belonged to obscure landed knights, merchants, ferrymen, and castle stewards scattered throughout the 7 kingdoms. Only one name stood apart from the rest. It had been written larger than the others, then crossed through with heavy ink. Damon stepped closer, narrowing his eyes before speaking. "I know that name." The room turned toward him. "Sir Alistair Buckwell. He served in the City Watch years ago before vanishing after accusations of corruption. We believed he had fled across the narrow sea." Harold frowned as he searched his memory. "Not fled," he corrected after a moment. "Disappeared. No ship ever recorded his passage." The Grand Maester slowly removed his spectacles, studying the crossed-out name with growing unease. "If he did not leave Westeros," the old scholar murmured, "someone ensured he vanished without leaving a trace." Aegon rested both hands upon the table. One forgotten officer could not possibly command a conspiracy spanning the realm, yet perhaps he had become its first servant. As darkness settled outside the castle walls, the king walked alone through the gallery, overlooking the throne room. Torches cast restless shadows across the iron throne below, making its countless blades seem almost alive in the flickering light. He remembered the confidence with which he had issued his first decrees only weeks earlier, convinced that decisive action would restore the authority of the crown. Instead, every command had been anticipated, twisted, or used to deepen the realm's divisions. His rebellion had become the perfect cover beneath which another, older design advanced unseen. For the first time, he questioned whether he had chosen the battlefield his enemy desired from the very beginning. His thoughts were interrupted by hurried footsteps echoing through the gallery. A young gold cloak, breathing hard from climbing the tower stairs, knelt before the king and struggled to steady his voice. "Your Grace, a rider has arrived from the Riverlands under a flag of truce." Aegon turned immediately. "From Lord Tully?" The guard shook his head. "No, Your Grace, the rider carried no house banner. He claims to serve those who hold Sir Brynden Tully. He brought a letter and insists it be read only by the king." Minutes later, the parchment lay unfolded beneath the light of a single candle in the royal solar. The handwriting matched the anonymous message delivered weeks earlier inside the iron-bound box. Once again, there was neither seal nor signature, only a few carefully chosen lines. "Come to Harrenhal with 50 men and no more. Bring neither banners nor armies. If you wish to save the heir of River Run, come alone enough to hear the truth. If you bring war, you will find only ashes." No man in the room spoke after the king finished reading. Harrenhal, greatest and most cursed of all the castles in Westeros, stood at the heart of the Riverlands, where every army eventually crossed paths. Whoever had written the invitation had not chosen the place by chance. Aegon folded the letter slowly and looked toward the dark window, overlooking King's Landing. Somewhere beyond the night, beneath the ruined towers of Harrenhal, an unseen enemy was no longer content to strike from the shadows. At last, they were asking the king to meet them face to face. The council argued until long after midnight, yet no agreement emerged from the storm of voices. Daemon insisted the summons to Harrenhal bore every mark of a carefully prepared trap, while the Grand Maester warned that the disappearance of a king in hostile country would throw the Seven Kingdoms into chaos before another raven could leave the castle. Harold listened more than he spoke, studying the anonymous letter for details that might reveal the author's mind. The parchment came from an expensive stock sold only in a handful of cities, but that discovery narrowed nothing. Whoever orchestrated the conspiracy had long since learned to leave clues that led in every direction at once. Egon allowed each advisor to finish before rising quietly from his chair. "If I refuse," he said, "they keep the air of River Run and choose the next move themselves. If I go, at least I seize one choice back." Preparations began before dawn, though few within the Red Keep understood their true purpose. 50 riders were selected exactly as the letter demanded, each chosen for discipline rather than noble birth or personal renown. They carried practical arms, plain cloaks, and enough provisions for a week's hard travel without support from nearby castles. The king ordered that another force remain hidden a day's ride behind, under Damon's command, close enough to respond if disaster struck, but far enough to avoid breaking the conditions of the meeting. Damon accepted the compromise with visible reluctance. "I dislike obeying the wishes of an unseen enemy," he admitted while tightening the straps of his gauntlets. Egon answered with a weary half-smile. "So do I, which is why I intend to discover who he is." Their road led north through lands growing increasingly unsettled with every passing day. Villages stood strangely quiet as they rode past, the fields worked by fewer hands than the season required. Many young men had disappeared from farms, some joining their lords, others slipping away without explanation. At crossroads, weathered signposts had been deliberately turned to point travelers in the wrong direction, forcing merchants into long detours and slowing the movement of news. Twice the company found burned wagons abandoned beside the road, their cargo untouched, while their drivers had vanished without trace. Harold dismounted at each scene, searching patiently for evidence. But whoever created such confusion understood how to erase themselves almost completely. On the fourth evening, they reached the southern shore of the God's Eye. The vast lake stretched beneath a gray sky without a ripple, disturbing its dark surface, reflecting broken clouds so perfectly that water and heaven seemed to merge into one endless sheet of cold steel. Across those waters rose the immense silhouette of Harrenhal, its melted towers twisted by dragonfire generations earlier into shapes unlike any other castle in Westeros. Even from miles away, the ruin dominated the horizon, larger than many towns, its black walls swallowing the fading light. Several of the younger riders crossed themselves instinctively. Too many stories lingered around Harrenhal for even hardened soldiers to ignore them entirely. They camped within sight of the castle but did not light large fires. As darkness settled over the lake shore, Harold walked the perimeter with 2 trusted scouts, pausing whenever the wind carried unfamiliar sounds across the water. Once he believed he heard distant hammering somewhere within the ruined fortress, though no glow of forge fires appeared among the shattered towers. Another time, a single lantern briefly flashed from an upper window before disappearing again. "They know we are here," one scout whispered. Harold nodded without taking his eyes from the castle. "They knew before we left King's Landing." Morning revealed Harrenhal in harsh detail. Great sections of the outer walls remained intact despite centuries of neglect, while other portions had collapsed into mountains of blackened stone, overgrown with weeds and twisted trees. Ravens circled endlessly above the tallest towers, their cries echoing across the empty courtyards beyond the gates. The drawbridge had been lowered, though no guards waited upon it. Instead, a lone figure wearing a plain dark cloak stood motionless in the center of the bridge, with empty hands visible at his sides. Aegon rode forward with Harold alone, leaving the remaining riders behind as agreed. The cloaked man bowed respectfully, but not deeply. He appeared neither old nor young, his beard trimmed short and streaked with gray, his face weathered more by long roads than comfortable halls. "His Grace is expected," he said in a calm voice. "Your companions may remain here. Only the king and Sir Harold will enter." Harold's hand rested lightly upon his sword. "Who commands this place?" The stranger regarded him almost sympathetically. "A man who has no desire for your death today." It was an answer carefully shaped to reveal nothing while sounding almost honest. They passed through towering gates into a courtyard where silence hung unnaturally heavy. No servants hurried across the stones, no horses stamped within the stables. Yet Aegon quickly noticed signs that the castle was far from abandoned. Fresh straw covered stable floors. Wells had been recently cleaned. Broken stairways had been repaired with new timber, still pale against ancient black stone. Small cook fires burned smokelessly within sheltered corners, and disciplined footprints crossed every yard. Hundreds of people had lived here recently, though at that moment scarcely a dozen could be seen. Harrenhal itself seemed to be hiding its inhabitants. The guide led them through a maze of corridors, untouched by sunlight, until they reached the vast hall of 100 hearths. Most of its legendary fireplaces stood cold, but several burned steadily, filling the enormous chamber with flickering amber light. At the far end stood a single long table set with bread, cheese, roasted venison, and untouched cups of wine. Beside it waited a solitary man dressed not as a lord, but as a prosperous merchant. His clothes were well made without displaying any heraldry, and a simple silver ring adorned one hand. He inclined his head respectfully as the king approached. "I thank you for honoring the invitation, Your Grace," the man said. His voice carried easily through the immense hall without needing to rise above a conversational tone. Aegon stopped several paces away, refusing the offered seat. "You have my attention," he replied. "Begin by explaining why Sir Brynden Tully was taken." The stranger folded his hands before him. "Because if he had remained free, Lord Tully would already have declared war upon the Westerlands. By tomorrow, House Lannister would have answered. Tens of thousands would now be marching for a crime neither committed." Daemon was not present to hear those words, yet Harold felt their unsettling logic immediately. The merchant stepped aside and gestured toward a side door. 2 armed men emerged, escorting a weary but unharmed Ser Brynden Tully. The young heir bore bruises upon his face and wrists, but walked under his own strength. His eyes widened the instant he recognized the king. Though no chains bound him, "They never tortured me," Brynden said before anyone else could speak. "They questioned me, fed me, and would tell me only that my capture prevented a greater slaughter." The merchant looked back toward Aegon. "You see the difficulty, Your Grace. We are called villains because we interrupt disasters before anyone realizes they were coming." Aegon's expression did not soften. "Then remove your hood completely," he said. Give me your name, your allegiance, and the authority by which you spill blood across my realm." The man remained silent for several heartbeats before slowly reaching toward the clasp of his cloak. "Names have little value now," he answered quietly. "But if truth is what you seek, then today you shall finally meet the man who began this conspiracy." As the cloak slipped from his shoulders, Harold took one involuntary step forward, for the face revealed beneath was one he recognized from old records, believed buried by time itself, a man officially declared dead nearly 20 years before. For several long moments, no one in the vast hall moved. The crackling hearths filled the silence while Sir Harold stared at the unveiled face before him, searching memory for details buried beneath decades of forgotten reports. At last, recognition settled upon him with the weight of cold iron. "Sir Alistair Buckwell," he said quietly, "you were declared dead after the riots in King's Landing." The man inclined his head without the slightest trace of triumph. "That was the intention. Dead men are rarely pursued. Forgotten men are even safer." Egon's gaze hardened, though he did not draw his sword. The man before him appeared older than the descriptions preserved in the royal archives, his hair touched with silver and deep lines marking years spent under burdens rather than comfort. Yet nothing in his bearing suggested weakness. He stood with the measured calm of a soldier who had survived countless battles without allowing victory or defeat to master him. "You disappeared with stolen coin," the king said. "You gathered armed men in secret. You murdered royal messengers and attacked my garrisons." Buckwell answered without haste. "Some of those accusations are true. Others were committed by men who wished you to believe they served me." Harold's hand remained upon the hilt of his sword. "The courier near Maidenpool," he said. "The attack at Rosby, the arrows from the Kingswood. Were those your work?" Buckwell met his eyes directly. "The courier was not. Rosby was not. The archer who silenced your prisoner was certainly not." He let the words settle before continuing. "You have been chasing one enemy while another quietly borrowed my shadow. Every crime committed by unknown hands became mine because it suited someone else to let you believe that." Sir Brandon Tully looked from one man to the other, confusion replacing the anger he had carried throughout his captivity. Egan stepped closer until only the long table separated them. "Then explain why you built hidden roads, supply depots, and secret companies across my kingdom." Buckwell rested both palms upon the worn oak. "Because I watched 3 reigns produce the same pattern. Proud lords sought greater power. Proud kings answered with force. Thousands died, and afterward nothing truly changed." The king's expression darkened immediately. "I did not come to hear speeches." Buckwell gave a faint nod. "Nor do I intend to give one. I built those networks so villages would survive the wars your nobles always promised one another. Food, medicine, hidden crossings, trusted messengers. At first that was all." The old captain walked slowly toward one of the enormous hearths where a map of Westeros rested upon a stand. Small wooden markers covered nearly every region of the realm. "Then I learned others had discovered my work," he continued. "Men with greater ambition than mine. They did not care about protecting villages or avoiding famine. They saw a ready-made web stretching across the 7 kingdoms. They infiltrated it piece by piece until loyal couriers vanished, supply caches changed hands, and captains I had trusted answered to strangers instead. He looked back toward Aegon. By the time I understood what had happened, I no longer commanded the organization everyone believed was mine. Harold frowned deeply. The scattered pieces of the puzzle shifted within his thoughts. The false banners, the forged royal warrants, the stolen treasury silver. They all began after your network was compromised. Buckwell nodded once. Exactly. You believed I had planned every move because every trail eventually led back toward my work. That was no accident. Someone wanted the king hunting ghosts while the true conspiracy spread unnoticed. Aegon remained silent, unwilling to accept the explanation without proof, yet unable to dismiss it outright. Sir Brynden stepped forward, rubbing the bruises left by his bindings. "Why capture me at all?" he demanded. "If your purpose was not war, why make me vanish?" Buckwell faced the young heir with visible regret. Because 3 assassins waited near River Run disguised as Lannister riders. They intended to kill you and leave witnesses alive. Your father would have marched west before the week ended. Brynden searched the older man's face for deceit, but found only exhaustion. Instead, I took you first. Your father cursed my name rather than burying his son. I judged that the lesser evil. The heavy doors of the hall suddenly burst open. One of Buckwell's sentries hurried inside, breathing hard after running through the vast corridors of Harrenhal. "Captain," he said urgently. Riders approached from the western road. More than 200. Buckwell's expression changed for the first time since revealing himself. It was not fear, but grim certainty. "No banners?" The sentry shook his head. "None?" Harold and Aegon exchanged a single glance. They both understood immediately. The hidden enemy had found Harrenhal. Buckwell strode toward another table where several sealed packets lay waiting. "There is no more time for careful explanations," he said, gathering the documents into a leather satchel before handing it directly to the king. "Inside are names, routes, accounts, and every officer I still believe loyal. It is incomplete, but it will show you where to begin." Aegon accepted the satchel cautiously. "Why give this to me now?" Buckwell smiled faintly, though sadness lingered behind it. "Because I began this network and I failed to protect it. The realm deserves one man to finish what another could not." The first horn sounded outside the castle walls. It echoed through Harrenhal's immense chambers, with a harsh, unfamiliar note unlike any call used by the great houses of Westeros. A second horn answered from the opposite side of the fortress, followed by the distant clash of steel. Harold moved instantly toward a narrow window overlooking the outer yard. Men in plain armor poured through a breached postern gate, advancing with disciplined ranks and carrying neither lions, wolves, dragons, nor stags upon their shields. They needed no heraldry. Their unity spoke more loudly than any banner. Buckwell drew his sword for the first time. Though age had silvered his hair, the blade settled into his hand with the confidence of long habit. "They came sooner than expected," he said quietly. "Which means they have spies even here." He looked toward Brynden. "Take the eastern passage. It leads beneath the old kitchens and out toward the lake shore." Then his eyes found Aegon. "Your Grace, if they kill you inside Harrenhal, the 7 kingdoms will burn before winter. Whatever you think of me, leave now." Aegon remained motionless for only a heartbeat before fastening the satchel across his shoulder. Every instinct urged him to stay and demand complete answers, yet the sounds spreading through the castle told him that time had vanished. Steel rang against steel somewhere beyond the hall, followed by the cries of wounded men. Smoke drifted beneath the great doors as torches overturned during the fighting. The unknown conspiracy had finally abandoned subtlety in favor of open violence. Together the king, Sir Harold, Sir Brynden, and Buckwell hurried toward the hidden eastern passage, but each understood the same hard truth. By the time they reached the lake, Harrenhal itself might already belong to the enemy. The hidden passage descended beneath Harrenhal through ancient tunnels older than the castle itself, their walls damp with centuries of seeping water. Torchlight danced across rough stone while echoes of battle rolled faintly overhead, each clash of steel reminding the fugitives how little time remained. Sir Brynden Tully struggled to match the relentless pace after days of captivity, but Harold refused to let him fall behind, pulling him forward whenever exhaustion threatened to overcome him. Behind them, Buckwell paused more than once to listen, judging the distance of pursuing footsteps with the practiced instincts of a veteran soldier. "They know these passages," he said at last, his voice low but certain. "Someone betrayed the last refuge I possessed." The tunnel emerged through a concealed opening among reeds on the eastern shore of the God's Eye. Cold wind swept across the dark water as waves lapped quietly against broken stones, and for a brief moment the world seemed untouched by the violence consuming the great fortress behind them. That illusion shattered when arrows hissed out from the trees lining the shore. One struck the ground at Aegon's feet. Another pierced the shoulder of a royal guardsman before he could raise his shield, and a third buried itself deep within the trunk of a willow. Men rushed from concealment wearing plain mail and featureless helmets, advancing in disciplined silence exactly as every previous report had described. There were no shouted commands. They had rehearsed this ambush countless times. Harold immediately formed the surviving guards into a defensive line while Brynden was pushed toward a waiting fishing boat concealed beneath woven nets. Buckwell fought beside the king without hesitation, his sword moving with surprising speed despite his years. "Get him across the lake," he shouted, turning aside a spear thrust before cutting down its owner. Aegon glanced toward him only once before recognizing the truth. The attackers had not come to negotiate or capture. They had come to erase every witness who understood the conspiracy, even partially. If the king died upon that lonely shore, every kingdom would blame another, and the unseen architects would remain exactly where they wished to be. The fighting spread across the narrow strip of land between the reeds and the forest. Harold met 3 attackers in rapid succession, his blade rising and falling with disciplined precision until one man lay dead and 2 others retreated bleeding into the trees. Brynden seized a discarded shield and stood beside the royal guards instead of fleeing immediately, proving that captivity had not diminished either his courage or his sense of honor. Aegon himself fought at the center of the line, his sword ringing against iron as another wave pressed forward. Still the enemy advanced with unnerving discipline, replacing every fallen man without hesitation. They neither celebrated success nor mourned losses. They existed only to complete their task. Buckwell suddenly turned toward the king, his expression calm despite the chaos surrounding them. "Your Grace," he called over the clash of steel, "remember one thing above all else." Aegon parried a heavy blow before looking toward him. Buckwell drove his sword into the chest of another attacker, then continued, "Do not wage war against the great houses alone. Make them defend the realm beside you. That is the victory our enemy fears." Before another word could be spoken, a crossbow bolt struck Buckwell beneath the ribs. He staggered, but remained standing, using the last of his strength to block the narrow path leading toward the boat while the others withdrew. Harold tried to reach him, but Buckwell shook his head firmly. "Go," he ordered. "My story ended years ago. Yours has not." More enemy soldiers poured from the trees, surrounding the wounded captain on 3 sides. He gave no ground. His sword rose and fell until another bolt struck, then another, and finally he disappeared beneath the tide of advancing men. The delay cost him his life, yet it bought the others the precious moments they required. By the time the attackers reached the shoreline, the fishing boat had already pushed into the cold waters of the God's Eye. The crossing took place beneath a sky heavy with approaching rain. None aboard the small vessel spoke for several minutes, each man listening to the fading sounds of battle carried across the water. Harrenhal stood black against the horizon, smoke rising from several towers where fires had begun to spread among ancient timbers. Brynden stared back toward the ruined fortress, silently honoring the man who had stolen his freedom only to preserve his life. Harold carefully untied the leather satchel Buckwell had entrusted to the king and removed the documents within. They were genuine, names filled page after page, along with hidden meeting places, coded signals, financial records, and lists of infiltrators buried inside royal offices, merchant guilds, and noble households alike. Several days later, the king returned to King's Landing beneath gray skies that matched the mood awaiting him. News of the fighting at Harrenhal had already spread through the realm, though every version contradicted the last. Some believed House Tully had attempted to assassinate the king. Others insisted Lannister soldiers had attacked the royal party. Still others whispered that ghosts from Harrenhal itself had risen to defend the cursed castle. Aegon ignored every rumor. For the first time since beginning his rebellion, he possessed evidence stronger than whispers. The conspiracy had faces, names, methods, and weaknesses. It was no longer an invisible shadow. The great hall of the Red Keep filled with lords from every corner of the 7 kingdoms within the fortnight. Many expected accusations, arrests, or declarations of war. Instead, Aegon ascended the steps of the Iron Throne carrying Buckwell's satchel in one hand and laid it openly upon the cold blades before him. His voice carried clearly through the chamber. "I believe the crown stood alone against those who weakened the realm. I was wrong." Murmurs spread immediately among the assembled nobles, but the king raised a hand before they could interrupt. "An enemy has hidden among every kingdom, every port, every court, and every road. They profit whenever dragon blames lion, wolf blames trout, or stag blames falcon." The satchel was opened before all present. Copies of the recovered ledgers, coded correspondence, forged warrants, and decoded names were distributed to the great houses under the watchful eyes of the King's Guard. Lords who had arrived expecting condemnation instead found evidence that members of their own households had been manipulated, bribed, or replaced without their knowledge. The accusations were no longer the king's alone. They rested upon records gathered over years and purchased at the cost of loyal lives. Damon watched the faces around the hall change from anger to uneasy recognition. Distrust remained, but it had found a new direction. In the months that followed, the hidden conspiracy slowly unraveled. Secret caches were seized before they could supply fresh violence. Forgers disappeared into royal prisons. Corrupt officials fled across the narrow sea or died resisting capture. Some conspirators escaped entirely, ensuring that no victory came without lingering uncertainty. Yet the organization that had nearly driven Westeros into endless civil war never recovered its reach. More importantly, the great houses, though still proud and often quarrelsome, recognized that they had all been used as pieces in another man's game. Reluctantly at first, then with growing resolve, they shared information rather than suspicion whenever new threats emerged. On a quiet evening, many months later, Aegon stood alone before the Iron Throne as he had on the morning his rebellion began. The throne had not changed. Its twisted swords remained as cold and unforgiving as ever. The man standing before it, however, had learned what steel alone could never teach. A king might command armies and issue decrees, but a realm survived only when truth traveled faster than fear. Beyond the windows of the Red Keep, the bells of King's Landing rang across Blackwater Bay, not to announce another war, but the arrival of peace hard won and dearly paid for. The rebellion that had begun with a king challenging his own lords ended not with the destruction of the Seven Kingdoms, but with their uneasy survival forged through sacrifice, bitter lessons, and the courage of those willing to stand against enemies who had hidden too long in the shadows. If you have walked through these halls, from the first tolling of the bells to the final silence before the Iron Throne, you have seen that power in Westeros is rarely lost in a single battle. More often it slips away through quiet betrayals, hidden bargains, forged letters and fears, whispered from one castle to the next, until neighbors become enemies without ever understanding why. A crown may command obedience, yet it cannot command trust, simply because gold and steel stand behind it. Every ruler believes that one decisive act will restore order, but each decision awakens consequences that cannot be recalled once they begin moving through the realm. That is the burden every king inherits, and it is the burden every lord eventually discovers cannot be escaped. You have also seen that honor survives in unexpected places. It is not always found beneath the brightest banners or inside the grandest castles, but often in the quiet choice to stand one's ground when no song will ever remember the sacrifice. Men such as Sir Harold and Alistair Buckwell walked different roads and served different causes, yet both understood that loyalty without conscience becomes another kind of tyranny. In George R.R.R. Martin's world, good men are not rewarded simply for being good, nor are cruel men guaranteed victory because they are ruthless. Every choice demands payment, and often the greatest victories belong not to those who live longest, but to those who leave the realm stronger than they found it. The Iron Throne itself remains what it has always been, not a prize but a test. Countless rulers have believed they possessed it only to discover that they served it instead. Its blades were forged from conquered swords, yet they cannot cut away doubt, ambition, or the ancient rivalries carried in the hearts of men. Stone walls cannot keep out suspicion. Strong gates cannot bar treachery. Even dragons, when they ruled the skies, could never burn away the quiet ambitions that grow wherever power gathers. That truth runs beneath every tale told in Westeros, whether it speaks of kings, knights, or the smallest village forgotten by history. Perhaps that is why these stories endure. They remind you that kingdoms are not held together by fear alone, nor by blood, nor by ancient names carved into banners. They endure because, despite betrayal and grief, there are always a few who choose duty over comfort, truth over convenience, and tomorrow over their own survival. Those choices seldom end the struggle forever, for another winter always waits beyond the horizon, and another generation will inherit both the victories and the mistakes of those who came before. Yet each sacrifice leaves behind something that swords cannot easily destroy, the chance that the next ruler may choose more wisely. And so the bells still ring across King's Landing as they did on that mist-covered morning when the story began. The harbor still wakes beneath gray skies, merchants still lift their shutters, ravens still take flight from the towers of the Red Keep, and the Iron Throne still waits in solemn silence for the next hand bold enough to claim it. If you listen closely, beneath the cries of the gulls and the murmur of the city, you may almost hear the echoes of every oath sworn, every secret kept, and every life spent in service to a realm forever balanced between order and ruin. Such is the way of Westeros, where every dawn promises peace, every sunset remembers war, and every new day begins with the sound of distant bells.